The X-Men is quite possibly Marvel's strongest and most stable franchise. In the massive house of ideas that is Marvel and all of the interconnected characters and little parts of the mythos that they have, the X-Men are one of the few characters that could actually say that they carried Marvel on their back, and even being a key part into them not being bankrupt anymore. In the 90s, they got hit hard by the speculator boom, but then through licensing out some of their projects or some of their characters to other film media sources, they were able to create movies like the X-Men films, like Blade, Hulk, Fantastic Four, and all of that. While that speculator boom was quite devastating to Marvel, the X-Men can claim that they have the highest selling comic book of all time. Chris Claremont's X-Men, #1 in the 90s with Jim Lee. That sold, if my calculations are correct, which I don't have the number in front of my face, but it was around 8 to 12 million copies, around there, maybe 7 million. That is a stupid amount of comic books sold, especially since it was just floppies that are very paper thin. If you ever held a single issue comic before, you know how easy they are to damage. It wasn't even a graphic novel like The Watchmen, which over time built a huge amount of wealth, right? I'm sure that graphic novel sold way more than that X-Men single issue, but that occurred in a very short, brief, miniature burst of time. That's what makes it so impressive. But at the end of the day, X-Men is a franchise that a lot of people have connected to because of their great storytelling and characters. And in general, the franchise has been celebrated as Marvel's most political property that they have, because they often tackle a lot of issues that we experience or see in the real world. They tackle bigotry, prejudice, and even the human struggle for acceptance. I think that is the heart of the X-Men itself, and this brings us to something called the mutant metaphor and the entire topic of this video. The idea that mutants themselves represent this marginalized group. It's a very ambitious concept in my opinion, especially when you look at the entirety of comic books and their history. But as I'm gonna go through more in depth in this video as I give my opinion, I'm gonna tell you how it started off with very good intentions, because it was a very creative way to explore discrimination through that fantastical lens. But over time, the message itself has been diluted. If you look at back in the day with the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era, they looked at it as an alien origin story lab experiment. It was a way to explain why the X-Men had powers. These guys over here are called mutants. They're born with the X gene, and that's how we make them a whole distinctive class when you compare them to the other heroes in the Marvel catalog. And that resonated with some readers, but it also led a lot of readers not exactly caring for it at all, seeing them to be not as creative as others like Spider-Man, Hulk, and the Fantastic Four. The book itself even got cancelled. It wasn't until Len Wein's reinvention in Uncanny X-Men of the team where it really started to come into its own. And then Chris Claremont and John Byrne came on board and really turned it into a superstar team. Quite possibly the best and most popular team there is in comics. They made it a reflection of how difference alone, something that is very much unchosen for a lot of people because they were born with these powers, can make you a target for hatred. In theory, this should be brilliant, right? But in the execution is when I started to see a lot of cracks in the metaphor itself. At its best, it's really just about alienation and identity, right? That is the universal story that a lot of us, no matter what race, religion, sex, whatever you are, it's something where you could be like, oh, I can see myself in your shoes, or maybe you're already wearing the damn sneakers. But this little non-specific vagueness is what made it so inclusive and what made it work so much. The undoing of all of this though, ironically, is that vagueness, right? The fact that writers were trying to expand and delve deep into that mutant metaphor, and that led to people trying to align mutants with real-world minorities way too directly. But before we start, we have to understand where it came from and the political roots of the X-Men themselves. let's rewind the clock back a bit to the 1960s when the X-Men first debuted, and you have to really understand the era that they were in when Stan and Jack made these characters. America itself was very much knee-deep, not even knee-deep, let's just say throat-deep. Pause. Okay, I gotta clarify myself. Let's just say that there was a tidal wave, a tsunami, and there was a huge flood, and you are neck-deep in water. Let's just say that. They were neck-deep in the civil rights era. Stan Lee himself has been cited to say that he wanted a superhero team that could explore these topics of racism, of intolerance, without making it bound to one specific, like, real-world group. So he created something called, as we all know, the mutants, right? The children of the atom. And they were born with some sort of unique power. They might have a secondary gene that gives them another unique ability, but that was more introduced in Grant Morrison's run. But it wasn't exactly like they were chosen or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe even the opposite of that if you consider how many people that these heroes have saved since their accident, but that's a whole other story. But they became this because of evolution. That was key to what made the X-Men different from everybody else. They didn't want to be different, they weren't made to be different, yet society themselves treated them as dangerous outcasts, which, let's be honest, that never really made sense to me. Why are people going to be, oh my goodness, is that the Fantastic Four? Oh my goodness, that is a giant block of rocks saving my baby. Oh, this guy that shoots a laser beam out of his eyes, ew, that's disgusting, icky, monster poo. Like, what are we doing here? That's the one thing that kind of irks me about Marvel and their mutant problems, but in general, what really made this cool is the idea of Professor X and Magneto having real-world counterparts. Particularly, they were modeled after Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Granted, I don't know if this was cited anywhere in particular, but a lot of us, especially if you are even a casual fan, they would end up saying things like this because that was the public perception and what really gave them this social allegory, right? Xavier and his beliefs are based on having some sort of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants and to educate those who are hateful. Magneto is more shaped by trauma and survival, not just out of the mutant persecution, but out of literally living as a Jewish boy in the Holocaust. So he has two completely different groups of trauma that blended itself together, which made him believe in self-defense and separatism. It's honestly really fascinating because one side believes in resistance while also eventually having a cohesion between two species. The other side believes in assimilation. That is all that the humans want them to do, and because on an evolutionary standpoint they can't, they will always be different, they have to fight back in the most violent ways possible. But once Marvel began taking that metaphor a bit too literally and using it as a one-to-one allegory for real-world discrimination, that is when I believe the mutant metaphor started to crack under the pressure. The more grounded these stories became, the more obvious it was for mutants to be feared and for it to not be irrational. When somebody can accidentally kill a crowd of people by, like, shooting a laser beam or even controlling the weather, there are even government-specified versions of these mutants. They are called Omega-level mutants. Mutants who can change history just by whirling their fingers. Characters like Storm, Iceman, even Magneto. In the recent X-Men 97 show, we saw that he could literally flip the world on its axis, turn off all the power, and if it stayed in that position, everybody would die. That is what we have to deal with here. It's more of a survival instinct rather than hate from the human side. The major problem, to break it back down, is the lack of equivalence. In the real world, point me to a marginalized group who is experiencing prejudice, whether it's from race, gender, sexuality, whatever, and tell me that they're inherently dangerous and that they're stronger than any other race, right? In the Marvel Universe, mutants can be and are. There isn't really any moral judgment to talk about. The fear itself that the public has, the normal humans on the ground, it's not irrational. And that complicates the metaphor itself because it makes the discrimination understandable in a real-world perception. And that is when things get really dicey, because you do not want to make discrimination understandable. That is horrible as a message. It stops being something about intolerance and more a question of, I guess, public safety, right? If we look at things like House of M, if we look at Decimation, or even Avengers vs. X-Men, that was a civil war between two sides of the superhuman community that led to casualties. If we look at House of M, Wanda literally said no more mutants, and it led to all the mutants becoming extinct with a select few surviving. If she ended up saying no more humans, they would be blipped off the map like the 2018 Avengers. That is the style that we're playing with. The fatal flaw in the metaphor system here, it unintentionally validates the fear and prejudice that a lot of these people are feeling instead of condemning it, instead of invoking the sympathy for the oppressed. But that raises the question, doesn't it? Are they really oppressed? We have to look at this allegory of a mutant being very symbolic. They are the stand-ins for people of color, for people of the LGBT community, for people who are disabled. But in the literal Marvel universe, mutants themselves aren't oppressed as a group of some shared social construct. They're actually a separate species, and they're called the Homo Superior. From an evolutionary standpoint, they couldn't be more distinct from humans. Just because they look like this doesn't mean they are that. Take Kryptonians from DC. They look like humans, but they couldn't be more far apart, especially if you look at the internal organs and DNA and how that leads to them being superhumanly strong on the 10th degree when compared to us as people. But the more I thought about it, think about it, they're a metaphor of replacement. Mutants themselves, not the good mutants of course, the good mutant sounds even crazy, even saying that as a sentence. The fact that I have to talk about it this way and it makes sense is crazy, but not the X-Men. I'm talking about the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and come on, Magneto, doesn't that sound like a PR branding nightmare? Why would you label yourself as that? That sounds like you know that you're in the wrong. Anyway, it looks like they're trying to fight against extinction, but through the complete domination of humanity. It now makes it into something that's not just a social or racial metaphor anymore. It leans more into the next step of evolution narrative. It shifts it into complete biological supremacy. The concept itself becomes very muddy, because if the moral message at the end of the day was supposed to be hate is wrong, why are we making it so that humans have a good reason to be terrified? The allegory itself starts to lose clarity. But let's get to some examples, shall we? We've been kind of dancing around it for a bit, but let's get to some specific parts that I want to talk about. And the most famous one that a lot of people like to bring up is Kitty Pryde and her very blunt, let's just say, confrontation with bigotry. So this is where the limits of parallelism really start to poke its head. So here, in one of the most famous storylines of all time with the X-Men and Chris Claremont's run, is God Loves, Man Kills. And this is a great storyline, and no one is going to clown on you for liking it. It is one of the best for a reason. Great art, great dialogue, and great messaging in a bubble. But when you start analyzing it and comparing it to the real world, you start to look at it a little bit with fuzzy eyes. The main villain that they have to face against is somebody that we all know as William Stryker, who's kind of like a religious zealot who believes mutants are abominations in the eyes of God. And at one point, Kitty Pryde takes out and lashes out her anger against a human friend for casually using a racial slur, which of course is the term mutie. And her anger is very justified in this circumstance and very powerful. But then she compares that slur against black people to anti-mutant hatred, saying that the N-word and mutie comes from the same place. It's raw, it's emotional, and it almost works, except for the fact that mutants themselves are a science fiction concept used to explore different storytelling methods, and black people are real. I know, crazy, right? But here we see them kind of pit both of these two classes of people against each other, and it's really hard to take what mutie... Hold on, let me stop before Kitty just faces to the screen and just slaps me. But mutants themselves are not real. Black people in real life have to face against discrimination, slavery, not being able to use all the proper public places, being told to sit at the back of the bus, not being given the rights that they deserve and the respect that they deserve for everything that they did for not only American culture, but around the world, and even in trade agreements, they were seen as less than. So it's hard to take a lot of the stuff seriously that Kitty is saying. On top of the fact that in this scene right here, this girl says they are only words, child, but no black person that is educated, especially in the era that this comic was coming from, no one would have said that if they were of this skin tone, especially if they see another class of people being targeted, because that just seems like a very artificial way to create conflict between two minority groups. Another instance was in X-Men Uncanny X-Men 196, where this guy Phil says, "Are you a mutie, Pride? What are you?" Blah 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 blah. And she says, "Are you a blank?" Right? She says hard R's, and even in the prior example, she said a hard R. Even in discussions in full-on conferences, she splurts out a bunch of slurs that people use to put down and label others. But in general, yeah, she's claiming it to be cruel, but she's also just blurting it out as a Jewish white woman. Like, what are we doing here? This just sounds not only insensitive, but also stupid, considering, as I've mentioned, mutants aren't real. Another example where this kind of works, actually, the mutant metaphor, is Genosha and that entire storyline in X-Men 235 to 238, Uncanny X-Men to be more specific. And the metaphor here takes its darkest and most extreme turn, because the nation of Genosha uses mutants as literal slaves. Their powers are stripped using inhibitor collars, and they're controlled by the local government. It's a very explicit and on-the-nose allegory for slavery, for apartheid, and for state-sponsored exploitation. The imagery is crazy. We have concentration camps, mass graves, and even, I'm pretty sure, quote me, don't even quote me actually, but correct me if I'm wrong, there is also breeding programs, so it's very disturbing, but once again, it works because the framing here is very alien and doesn't try to juxtapose these characters with another race. It takes it from a very localized standpoint, even using a fictional nation. But it's also important to remember that they are an entirely different species with powers capable of toppling these nations, and it really only works as a political thriller, or I guess as a grim what-if scenario. When you start to apply that racial category to a more grounded setting, then that is where it starts to collapse. Even here, it was on the brink of doing so. But if you want a better example of where it actually works, instead of, a situation where they omit to use some of their bag of tricks, let's look at Grant Morrison's New X-Men, when Cassandra Nova drops a bunch of next-level Sentinels onto the nation of Genosha, leading to a mass genocide event. And why this is really shocking and why it works is because the emotional resonance itself is very cosmic in nature, and it somewhat dilutes the message and keeps it in a very fictional setting, right? We have a story here about a psychotic supervillain with psychic abilities vaporizing a city with alien technology, and yeah, the allegory itself becomes more spectacle. The loss of intimacy with the real world and those connections is where the message becomes greater. Now, my opinion here has been all fine and dandy, but I've just been rambling on why this doesn't work. Maybe something that could be more productive or constructive is how I believe this can be improved, or just, my little anecdotes here and there. And I'm not a writing specialist by any means, and you guys might have some ideas on how to fix this down below, if you even believe that it needs fixing in general. But thematically, what is the X-Men? They work the best when they are outsiders and not threats. The best X-Men stories, in my opinion, work on and focus on individual experiences of people from different groups of whatever mutation that you want to say, feeling alienated, right? Nightcrawler and his religious rejection, facing that from the people of his own faith. He's one of the most wholesome people that there is, but he looks like a literal demon. Rogue and her struggle with touch and intimacy, and how that really impacts the people that she loves, right? Her love life and her partners. or even Cyclops and him bearing the pressure of leadership in a world that completely despises him. These are human stories or mutant stories about belonging. That is what they need to focus on. When Marvel decides to broaden that lens and that picture, the canvas itself, to treat mutant kind as its own geopolitical entity, whether that be Krakoa, Genosha, or what's that next one? The second version, second gen of Genosha, Utopia, what a name, huh? These themes itself, it shifts out of a place of empathy and into a place of power politics. It's not just them throwing questions at the board on why can't they be accepted, and more of like what happens when the oppressed themselves become more dominant, when they become their own mutant faction. And this is really good for storytelling, but when they start to flip it back to the mutant metaphor, that is when it gets a little more dissonant. In my opinion, the human cost of systemic oppression here can't really be equated in a fictional setting, as I've said before, right? The sincerity itself clashes with our real world logic. But despite all of these flaws, the mutant metaphor, and why a lot of us still enjoy it despite what it might accidentally push, is that it endures. Why is that? Because it tries. It's one of the few mainstream superhero concepts, I believe, that consistently engages with real world pain that humans experience and those injustices. It invites us to have a discussion and a reflection. A lot of the stuff that we see in comics lead us to look at ourselves, to introspect and be like, wait, am I treating others the way that I want to be treated? Am I being mean? Am I being prejudiced? Is this how our heroes want us to act? But you can actually have your cake and eat it too in this scenario, because the universal truth is that the fear of rejection for being who you are, and that is so simple, but that is what X-Men stories are about, the core of it, metaphor or not. The solution isn't to abandon it, but to reframe the entire concept itself, right? Stop treating mutants as analogs for real-world minorities, and instead treat them, as I've said, for mirrors of oppression and the psychology of all of that, the reason why somebody would hate their fellow neighbor, right? Why is that? Why would people do what they do? But also, why that should be shunned, especially when there's people who are trying to help you of the race that you're hating. Does that make sense? In other words, I guess, don't make mutants a metaphor for racism. Make them a metaphor for the experience of being feared, misunderstood, and alienated. All of that fits into the puzzle piece that is the X-Men. They're already doing all of those stuff. Just clean it up a bit. They're telling the stories of persecution, of identity. They work best when grounded in character-driven drama, as I've said before through my examples of Cyclops, Rogue, and Nightcrawler, rather than an examination of a species-level allegory. Remember, the X-Men themselves, they're mutants as individuals first, and as anomalies second from an evolutionary standpoint. Stop making it the first thing that characterizes them as a whole. That is when the metaphor starts to breathe again. It works because it's not trying to pigeonhole itself into one thing, but as a universal struggle. The feeling of trying to be accepted in a world that fears difference. If you're not like me, you are against me. But yeah, guys, that was a bit of a messy rant, just trying to get my thoughts out there. And obviously, if you have seen a bit of my other videos in the past, you know this is a different format, fitting more in line with the Young Justice video I did over a month ago. Do you guys kind of like these videos? If you do, I'll continue making more of them. But yeah, guys, what do you think about the mutant metaphor down below? Would you change it? Will you keep it? Would you rework it? Let me know your thoughts down below. Remember to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications so you know when a new video goes live. And yeah, see you all later. Take care. Deuces. Peace.